So I know I usually upload the odd random video about air guns, but I thought I've been thinking a while about talking about Floyd Rose style tremolo systems, or vibrato systems if you want to be pedantic. This is not a Floyd Rose. This is actually, technically, it's a Goto GE 1996T on this beautiful Japanese Stratocaster. This is quite a unusual model. You won't find very many of because they are Japanese market only, but it's a what's it called again? ST62-FR, which means it's their 1962 reissue, but the -FR means it's got the Floyd style trem, and it's an HSS, obviously not with the original pickups because I'm a filthy heretic and I put EMGs in it, the Steve Lukather set, not obviously the Steve Lukather loaded pickguard, because that's not going to fly with a 1962 spec pickguard, and you can't buy a 1962 spec pickguard that's HSS and cut for a Floyd style trem. That does not exist. So yeah, that's a problem. That I mean, you could. It's a difference of one screw, but you know, I just put. EMGs are so easy to install anyway. But yeah, I want to talk about floating trems. So a lot of people have problems with diving or pulling up on the trem and then finding that it's a few cents high or a few cents low, depending. It doesn't quite return to zero. And this is not necessarily a problem just with Floyds. It's a problem with basically every type of trem, although I have seen some information that would suggest that the Kaler trems don't do it. But you could basically say just about every floating trem does this, and people put trem stabilizers in them and all that, and I'm going to be trying out a trem stabilizer in this soon, but that's more because I palm mute a lot, and it's not so much about the diving issue, not coming back into tune. Now, the reason why this happens, and a lot of people point to the knife edges not being quite right, and on a GE 1996T or a German-made Floyd or something of that nature, there shouldn't really be a problem with the knife edges. That isn't why this happens, why it doesn't quite come back in tune. The reason is because you've got springs in the back, and you've got them counteracting the string tension. So you're essentially relying on the strings to behave like a spring, and guitar strings make really shitty springs, let's just be honest, in order for it to return to zero. And you've got 6 of these, and they all have slightly different tensions, and what happens is that the tension essentially gets, as far as I'm kind of conceptualizing this, the tension gets redistributed somehow. It doesn't quite return to zero. Now, the solution for this, and there's very few people talking about this, I haven't found any videos explaining this at all. I've come across this maybe 1 or 2 comments in the comment section, buried deep in the comment section of a few videos about this issue with floating trem systems. What you need to do is you need to tune the guitar to the dive condition or the pull up condition, or the other one is where you bend a string and it pulls on your trem, and then all your strings are very slightly flat after that. So those, you could think of each of those as three slightly different conditions that the trem system can be in, different states that it can be in, and you can get it back out of one of those states just by moving the bar. Just slightly moving the bar, it'll go back into tune, because it's a locking trem system. It shouldn't really have a problem with tuning. It just can't quite get back there because the strings aren't quite responding the way that a spring would. So what you've got to do is you've got to tune it. So let's say you dive a lot on the bar. So what you can do is just dive the trem and then tune. And what will happen is, if you're tuning up with your fine tuners, that may be enough to pull it back into the in tune state. So when you move on to the next string, dive it again. And with a floating trem, you've got to go back and forth a couple of times to get it all balanced out and get it all tuned. But each time, dive the bar before you go to tune the string. And then what happens is that you mess around, you pull up on the bar, whatever. You just got to get into the habit of giving a slight dive on that bar before you keep on playing, and that's going to always put it back in tune. The same if you're pulling up a lot. Whatever you happen to be doing the most of, I think, in my opinion, you need to be tuning the guitar for the most likely state that guitar is going to be in, that trem system is the likely state it's going to be in. And that, I think, solves most of the problems with floating trem systems. The other thing I would say is that the way people use trems varies a lot. So you'll see some of these really good guitar players, like the ones that their ears are tuned right in and they're constantly intonating. They're constantly adjusting the tuning with their fingers and using the trem in order to sweeten the tuning, especially when they're sustaining chords. There's a YouTuber by the name of Floyd, who's a very, very good guitar player, who does a lot of, I suppose, jazz fusion type music. I'm not an expert on that type of music that he plays, but all I know is that he really knows his stuff. And he doesn't do acrobatics with the bar. He's not doing any of that Steve Vai stuff, but he likes to have a trem system on pretty much all his guitars. And what he's doing is he's just he's just giving it a little wave at the end of his chords and stuff like that, in order to kind of counteract the problems that you get with the tempered scale system, the equal temperament musical system, which, if you don't know, in the 12-tone system, every note is essentially very, very slightly out of tune in order to because if you were to make a scale that was perfectly in tune, then if you move to another key in a 12-tone scale, all of those notes are going to be badly out of tune. So that's just temperament versus equal temperament. It's more well known now than it was when I first started playing guitar 20 years ago. People have become aware of it, and especially when you're playing with a lot of distortion, it really becomes apparent. Now, I tend to tune my guitar to work with whatever chords I happen to be playing, so my guitar's quite often technically out of tune, but it's sounding good. And some very great players have been doing that for a long time. Some of them may not have even known that that's what they're up to. Look at Eddie Van Halen's Running with the Devil track and how perfect those triads he's playing sound. They don't sound like that when you tune to a digital tuner. But if you're tuned properly to a digital tuner, what Andre Flood was talking about was, just very, very subtle, almost can't hear it vibrato using the whammy bar. When you're sustaining those chords, just sweetens everything up. So all of that is to say that potentially you're using the bar wrong, because in my opinion the whammy bar is super powerful, and I've only really, since I got this guitar, started to actually use them because I was afraid of them, because they always put my guitar out of tune, and that's a me problem rather than a problem with the guitar, because I didn't know how to use it properly. So what you really should be doing is actually just constantly using the bar, like not necessarily even as an effect, but as a way of like constantly tuning the guitar in real time. And I mean, you need to have a good ear for that, but that can come with time. But constantly just giving a subtle little bit of vibrato there, and if you're hearing things not quite in tune, after you've used the bar, you just reset it as you're playing. And I think that knowing that there are multiple states that trem system can be in, and knowing that you can use the bar to basically intonate the guitar in real time while you're playing it, and add a little bit of subtle vibrato to everything to kind of hide the fact that the guitar is essentially out of tune at all times anyway because of the equal temperament scale. When you combine those two things, I think you pretty much eliminate all the problems with the trem systems not quite returning to zero without needing a trem stabilizer. Although a trem stabilizer is a powerful tool, and Steve Vai uses them in all his guitars, which is no wonder when you see what he does with it. But you do lose the ability to flutter when you do that. Now, with all that out of the way, sorry I didn't play any guitar in this video. I do have flatmates that work different hours from me, so they have to get up at 4 AM, so I'm not exactly going to play right now, and I just did this on a whim. But I think this explanation should possibly help you if you're having this trouble with your trem system. It may not fix some of the issues that you get with the cheaper Floyds, because they have soft metal in them, and they can have problems. But this is a problem. This is a problem that affects all floating trem systems. So not just your locking trems. That's another thing. A lot of guitar players have been shifting away from the Floyd style trems in favour of a 2-point trem and locking tuners. Even Steve Lukather's done that. A lot of the big name '80s guitar players have done that, and a lot of the modern shredders too are not using the locking trem systems anymore. And that's not to say that the locking trem is not a brilliant design. It does have its flaws, and they can be a pain in the bum, but I think they were addressing problems with guitars of the time, and a lot of those problems have been fixed by getting your nut slots sorted out, or possibly using a Graphtec nut, making sure everything's smooth and lubricated, and strings moving freely, and locking tuners. That's the big one, locking tuners. But pardon me, even with a vintage spec Fender, a vintage spec Strat, you should be able to get that that trem system to work properly. I mean, not doing dive bombs and stuff like that potentially, but you should be able to get a vintage spec Strat to play well in tune, and plenty of big name guitar players back in the day made those things work. If you look at Jeff Beck, he used that bar a ton, and I suspect part of that is that they had guitar techs. These guys had guitar techs that knew how to set these things up, and a lot of the knowledge about how to set these things up wasn't common. Not until recently, when we had the internet and people started to spread this information. So yes, I don't think you should write off any particular trem system without first trying to understand it and understand what it can and can't do, and what can cause it to not work properly, and understand that all floating trem systems pretty much are going to have that issue with not returning to zero. It's not something wrong with your trem if it's doing that. It's something that is just inherent, and you just need to adapt your